professor of philosophy at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida, and I am also the director of the program in the history and philosophy of science. Well, I suppose it's philosophy first and foremost. Philosophy is interested particularly in epistemological questions, the nature of reality and these sorts of things. And so philosophy of biology then is looking at biology, the subject of biology, and asking the kinds of questions that philosophers ask about the nature of understanding there, the possibilities of prediction, and testing, and those sorts of things. In other words, where biologists look at organisms, philosophers look at biologists, although we're not sociologists or psychologists. We're not interested so much in the psychological makeup of biologists, but of the work that they do. And the sorts of questions we ask are questions like, is biology a science the same kind that physics is, or are there different sorts of issues, and that sort of thing. Now, I've said epistemology, because the other area of philosophy is ethics, morality. I think it's been the case that, by and large, most philosophers of biology have not focused very much on ethical understanding, but some of us, and I'm one, have certainly been interested in these issues too. There are philosophers who take it as a very important task of philosophy of biology to contribute to problems in biology, and I think somebody like Bill Wimsatt would be a case in point, and the kind of work he's doing is very sympathetic to theoretical biology in certain ways. I personally want to emphasize the philosophy part of philosophy of biology, and to be perfectly candid, I don't see my mission in life as contributing to problems in biology. It doesn't mean to say that biologists might not read something that I do, find it of interest and help, but I don't see that that's what I'm trying to do. I'm a philosopher, and I've got philosophical problems that I want to understand. So, for instance, to take an example, in physics, at least since the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century, one no longer uses what Aristotle called final cause talk. One no longer asks questions like, what is the function of the moon? Or what are volcanoes for? I mean, the moon just is. Volcanoes erupt. I mean, they have effects, but they're not effects for anything. They may affect us, but they don't exist in order to affect us. Whereas in biology, you do find that kind of final cause language. I mean, I say, what is the function of the nodes, for instance, or to take sorts of things that biologists are interested in, sexual organs. What is the function of the breasts of a woman? Is it just to feed the baby? Is it sexual attraction? Things of this nature. But the point is, however you answer these questions, and of course biologists may well differ about the sorts of answers they give. I mean, to take an example, the Stegosaurus with the funny plates all along its back, some have said that that's for fighting, others have said it's for sexual attraction, others now think that it's for heat disposal. So you can argue that. The question is, why does it make sense in biology to ask a question like, what are the plates on the back of the Stegosaurus for? Whereas it doesn't make sense in physics to say, what are volcanoes for? Or geology or something like that. And so I take it to be a philosophical question, is, well, what's going on here? Why can we use the language in the one case, not in the other? Now, if biologists look at what I'm saying and say, oh gosh, yes, you know, you want to explain it in terms of the fact that because of natural selection, organisms are designed like in a way that physical objects are not. And biologists might read this and say, you know, that's very helpful because that gives, we know a lot about design and that gives us some insights. For instance, perhaps we may have bad design. We shouldn't always think that design is going to work. So it may well be that a biologist would read what I'm doing and find what I'm doing quite helpful. But I'm not doing it to help biologists. I'm doing it because I think that this is an important question about the nature of understanding. And it's certainly a traditional question, one that Immanuel Kant wrestled with in the Third Critique, one obviously that Aristotle wrestled with in several of his writings. So as I say, I'm looking upon this as a philosophical question, not a biological question. And I don't go into the business saying, well, I'm going to help biologists. That's not my job. The fact of the matter is, after Darwin published, some philosophers, particularly the American pragmatists, Charles Sanders Peirce and William James and John Dewey, took Darwin very seriously, and they very much wanted to incorporate aspects of Darwinian theory into their philosophical understanding, and I think they did. I mean, I don't think there's any question. Whereas, on the other hand, others, particularly, well, certainly the continental philosophers, the British analytic philosophers, wanted very little to do with evolutionary theory. I mean, Wittgenstein is famous for saying in the, is it in the no, I think it's in the Tractatus, he says that biology is no more, relevant to philosophy than any other scientific theory. And I think that people like myself, and not all philosophers of biology would agree on this, I don't think, but people like myself and others, particularly my friend, the late David Hull, really felt that it had to make a difference, that if we are the end products of evolution through natural selection, rather than the miraculous creation of a good God on the sixth day, really has to make a difference to what's going on there. Darwinism is, yeah, it's one of the, it's right up there, right at the top, with the all-time important discoveries. It has, I think, profound implications for understanding not only the world, but ourselves. Because of that, it can be, and is, often deeply, deeply threatening. I mean, not just to creationists, but, for instance, a lot of my fellow philosophers, for instance, don't like the selfish gene. They think that this implies some kind of harshness and callousness. So they're, they're what we call in the trade group selectionists. So, I mean, at various levels, it really does cut very deeply. Although David and I didn't work in parallel, in conjunction, I think we both felt very strongly that our understanding of the world, and particularly our understanding of morality, has in some very important sense to be infused by biological understanding. Let me give you an example. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is your neighbor? Well, Jesus really rather implies that everybody is your neighbor. I mean, the story of the Good Samaritan, for instance, it seems to me, implies that we have as much an obligation to the total stranger as we do to our friends and as we do to our relatives. Whereas I'm inclined to think that a more Darwinian perspective certainly wouldn't say we don't have any obligations to strangers. And I think that any Darwinian who said that their theory justifies walking by a child who's fallen down and crying, and you just simply say, not my kid, I think anybody who said that on Darwinian principles, I think Darwinians would look at them somewhat askance. On the other hand, I do think that Darwinians would suggest that maybe biology is important, and that, for instance, we have greater obligations to our own children than to the children of others, and certainly to the children of strangers. And so, for instance, if Natalie, I mean, let's suppose, Natalie, you've got 5 children, and somebody says to me, oh, Natalie, she is a saint. And I say, why is that? And they say, well, because Natalie gives all her income, 9/10 of her income, to the Salvation Army, or, Médecins Sans Frontières, or something good. And I say, yes, but that means, she and her 5 children only have, 200 euros a month to live on. They say, yes, well, I'm afraid they live in poverty. They never eat meat, and the children, have to, beg for, clothing. Well, I'm going to say, no, I'm not sure that Natalie is a saint. Charity, as the English expression is, charity begins at home. And I would want to say that biology suggests not that we have no obligations to others, but that maybe there is a differential morality. And Darwin shows why. So I do think that, I personally think that evolutionary theory does have importance for traditional philosophy in that sort of way. And I think it can come up with some results that, well, certainly challenge what others have said, and particularly, I think, would challenge a lot of what Christians, well, not necessarily what Christians do, but what Christians claim to do. There were two great philosophers before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and one was Heraclitus, and the other was Parmenides. And Heraclitus is famous for saying everything changes. You cannot step into the same river twice. And Parmenides was famous for saying nothing changes. And of course, Zeno's paradoxes supposedly show. And I think that Plato brought the two together. He said there are these eternal forms, and then we have change. And that's the way I like to regard Darwin today. Obviously, everything has changed. Darwin had no deep knowledge, let us say, of symbiosis and a lot of issues like that. I mean, Darwin just didn't have that. I mean, Darwin didn't know about molecular biology. He didn't know about genetics. So he didn't know about sociobiology. So obviously, kin selection. So obviously, since Darwin, everything's changed. So at one level, nothing is Darwin. And yet, at the same time, the whole theory is deeply, deeply, deeply Darwinian. I mean, natural selection is still, more than anything, considered to be the basic mechanism of change. Now, I know every now and then, somebody like Steve Gould comes along and starts pushing mutations for saltations, and others start pushing, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, and people like Brian Goodwin, going back to Darcy Thompson, want to say that physics can do it all. But by and large, even if these have some effect, I don't think anybody thinks that they're that deep. I mean, no practicing biologist, but it's natural selection. And so, at that level, I would want to say Darwin is as relevant, more relevant than he's ever been before. And I think if Darwin came back to life, I think Darwin would be very, very, very excited. Let me take an example of something which was discovered in the last 10, 20 years. We've always said, Darwin says it in The Origin, one of the most important pieces of information proving evolution is homology, the similarities between the forelimb of the human, the arm of the human, and the forelimb of the horse, and the wing of the bird, and the flipper of the whale. They're same bones, but different, altered around. Now, every Darwinian, every evolutionist says, yes, Darwin was absolutely right to point to that. And of course, we believe that today. But now here's the example. About 50 years ago, or it was 50 years ago now, the late Ernst Mayr, the eminent ornithologist and evolutionist who was born in Germany but worked most of his life in America, wrote a big book called Animal Species and Evolution. And in it, he talks about homology and says how important it is. And then he says, but of course, you've got to be sensible about homology. Nobody thinks there's going to be homologies between flies and humans. That's silly. Well, in the last 20 years, molecular biologists have shown, in fact, the genes are just the same. Exactly the same. Now, it means that organisms are built on the Lego principle, that little children's building block. And you start with the building blocks, and then one way you build, let's say, the Eiffel Tower, and another way you build the Empire State Building. It's the same building blocks, but two completely different buildings. And so, I mean, first of all, evolutionists are excited about this. Secondly, it's obviously something completely new that Ma was denying. Now, what do we say about this? Do we say, oh, Darwin was wrong? Of course we don't. We say Darwin was more right than he ever thought he was. So yes, it has changed. Of course it changed. Ma said this, now we say that. But at the same time, nothing has changed. It's Darwinism, you know, that story about the earth being on top of an elephant, and the elephant's on top of a turtle, and what's the turtle on? Well, it's turtles all the way down. It's natural selection all the way down. Well, first of all, let's note creationism, as we understand it today, is not traditional Christianity. It's not something that you find in St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or Luther or Calvin. Even those, Luther and Calvin, who took the Bible very seriously. It's not that. Now, it's very much a creation of 19th century, early 19th century American Protestants who were looking for an ideology, often in the South, to justify slavery. And so, of course, they wanted to read the Bible absolutely literally. Now, even then they didn't, because most of them believed in an old earth. They said the 6 days of creation are very long periods of time. It's only after the Second World War, and particularly with the publication of a book in 1961, Genesis Flood, that people have become what they call young earth creationists, believing in 6,000 years and 6 days, literal days of creation, and humans coming last, and then a flood. And that was very popular in the 60s and 70s. And I think it was very much bound up with the Cold War and the worry about atomic warfare and that Armageddon is coming. And so the flood was, as it were, the first sort of the first big blow-up, and the Armageddon is going to be the last one. And that was, they tried to get it into the schools in America, but of course the Constitution, First Amendment, separates church and state, so they didn't succeed. And then, around about 1990, a new version came along, intelligent design theory, pushed by people like Philip Johnson, and then more recently by Michael Behe, the biologist who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and Bill Dembski, William Dembski, mathematician, philosopher. And they've been pushing intelligent design theory, where they say, oh, the world is too complex, the biological world is too complex to be explained by blind law, therefore there must have been an intelligent designer. Some of them believe in young earth creation, some of them believe in old earth creation, but they all ultimately want to go back to the Bible. And this too has been batted down, but it's still going. But my personal opinion is that although there are theological issues here, it's as much a cultural and social culture wars fight. That on the one hand, you're going to have evolutionists like Richard Dawkins, who are going to be in favor of abortion on demand, against capital punishment, in favor of feminism and those sorts of things. And then on the other hand, you're going to have the creationists or young earth, or the intelligent designers who are against abortion, in favor of capital punishment, anti-feminism, and these sorts of things. I mean, very interesting. Philip Johnson, the intelligent designer, if you read his books, he is obsessed with cross-dressing, about people who are wearing the clothes of the other sex. And I began to wonder, I don't think that Richard Dawkins goes home in the evening and puts on a bra and panties. I mean, by and large, the evolutionists I know are not cross-dressers. And then I remember talking about this, giving a lecture, I think it was in Oxford, 3 or 4 years ago, and some woman put up her hand and said, "You've missed it. What he's really worried about are people like you. Stroppy broads, strong-minded women wearing trousers. That's what's worrying him. You're transgressing, as it were, the traditional gender roles. And what they're keen to do is re-establish those gender roles. So when he's talking about cross-dressing, he's not talking about me putting on a bra. He's talking about you putting on jeans, because he doesn't find me threatening, but he finds you very threatening, because you are, as it were, transgressing his Kinderkirchenkuchen sort of vision of the world. And it's very true, you know. I mean, we know that the Catholic Church won't allow women to become priests. Neither will the Southern Baptists allow women to become ministers. You go to these big mega churches, and they will have 20, 30 ministers, you know, some working with youths, some working, I mean, they really do. But none of them are women. They'll have a lot of women employees, and the women will be doing things like youth work or prison work. I mean, I don't mean that these women, and they're often very well educated, but they're not ministers.